So, inshallah, alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, we will be going over what we're going to do, and hopefully, inshallah. So, inshallah. All right, here we go. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Our class is called Fiqh of Worship. And because it's called Fiqh of Worship, I thought it would be a good idea to make a complete summary or at least choose a summarized book for Fiqh of Worship to make it rather than get carried away with all the details in fiqh, which is something that I end up doing and I know about myself. So, inshallah, by choosing al-Mulakhas al-Fiqhi, it'll probably get me within a certain border. It'll get me to help us go through a number of different details. We'll be talking about the fiqh of purification and also fiqh of worship regarding fiqh of salah. The fiqh of worship class is usually within different classifications. So we would have fiqh of worship to mean one, tahara, two, chapter two would be chapter salah, three would be zakah, four would be siyam, and five would be the hajj and umrah. That's how it usually goes. But of course, because we're trying to not expand too much, so hopefully we'll be using these two resources. Now, these resources, they're really the same resource. This is the Arabic side of it. This is the English side of it. The English side of it, you could see a summary of Islamic jurisprudence. That's the same book as this one. The translation is not always the best translation, but hey, it will do the job. It is definitely definitely a helpful resource. So it makes it easy for you to go over and makes it easy for you to, I guess, keep up with what we're doing. You could use your English side and I'll use my Arabic side and side to side so we could see those subjects that we're going to be discussing, inshallah. You could see al-Mulakhas al-Fiqhi here, the chapters, so that's easy for you to see. And within these chapters, of course, you will get to know what we're going to be talking about throughout our lessons. It's going to be pretty easy. Let's just go over it really quick. We're going to be talking about purification and water. You could see in other books, they usually take almost 40 pages just discussing this, and sometimes even 100 pages. But here they discussed it in about 5 pages, and I would say that that's pretty much a good amount to kind of give an overview and give a summary and at the same time get to the point, and I would say get to the preponderant as well, because if somebody is taking Islamic jurisprudence, at least if it's a first time class and studying fiqh, I would definitely want someone to kind of first get the taste of it, and I don't want to put them into solids and without trying to introduce them to first getting little bits and pieces of these simple solids before we start giving them these chunks. And that's exactly what this book does. So it won't take you, off, I guess let's call it your milk. Let's do it that way, and get you into going into solids right away and start feeling that, okay, this class is too hard for me. This is too advanced and I'm getting lost. So we basically get into making these one, the preponderant ruling, making it fast, not going into too many details, at the same time discussing the hadith that relate to the subject, the ayat that relate to the subject, and not going into too many details. Chapter 2, disbelievers, pots and clothes. I want you just realize that the chapters, although it sounds like a big chapter, the word chapter sounds like a very big word, but it's not a very big word. You could see from the page numbers that there are about 4 or 5 pages, so not too bad per chapter, which actually would make it at least something that kind of keeps us on track. So this is the good news with it. The ritual impurity, the prohibited things to do, the etiquette of call of nature. So basically going to the bathroom and all of that, the siwak, natural disposition, wudu, the different ways, the different wiping, the rituals, tayammum, etc. Then we would go into prayer. You could see we've got a couple, we've got almost 30 chapters. Our goal, hopefully, just because of time, our goal is to complete more than one chapter in class. That's what hopefully we could do. Some classes we might actually get stuck on one chapter, probably longer time because of its importance, and probably because sometimes I would feel that as women, we might need some more details to talk about than what the book is probably covering. So take your notes, get your pens right there ready to kind of take some notes, write down some things. Definitely there are some issues that are probably on your mind that have not been discussed in the book because the book wants to kind of stick to the core issues. But I know you'll have questions that are related to, let's call it contemporary issues that's related to probably women, which probably the author did not necessarily go in details with. So I'll try as much as I can to stick to the chapters, stick to also what concerns you in regards to prayer and all of that. And hopefully we'll be finishing up until here. We're looking at 293 pages. So I do anticipate that we might actually end up doing something similar to what we had done in tafsir and hadith, where we might need to probably, go over other classes and perhaps just insist on needing to finish the chapters that we're doing. So I do anticipate we need to do that, but at least definitely encourage yourself to finish at least the fiqh of purification and fiqh of salah and feel that I had covered each and every single topic that I would find in a more advanced fiqh book. Okay, so even if you were to go to any fiqh book, it's going to be in this order and it's going to be discussing these matters. Yes, certainly in other fiqh books, they might actually discuss it in more details, discussing the evidences, etc. But this one is definitely going to give you, let's call it the final conclusion, making the story short. And certainly it's important to mention that the author is Hanbali based, so I'm familiar with that, slash Salafi based. I don't always use Salafi. And one thing I liked about his book is that one, it's got a good translation. Two, basically sticks to the hadith and sticks to at least not always the standard Salafi opinion. Sometimes he will actually consider another opinion, which he finds has stronger evidence. And that's one thing I really liked about that. It's not necessarily super ultra conservative about, let's call it, about his background in terms of what school he follows, but he tries as much as he can to stick to the evidence, which is pretty cool, which is pretty good, not always available. So inshallah, we're going to break down a lot of different things. We will talk about, let's see, Kitab al-Tahara right there. We will talk about a lot of pretty much everything, I should say. I shouldn't say a lot of, I should say pretty much everything. So let's look over it really quick. We're talking about things that nullify wudu. We're talking about the ritual bath, which is called ghusl. We're talking about tayammum. We're talking about removal impurities. We're talking about menstruation. We're talking about the 5 daily prayers. We're talking about the conditions. We're talking about the manners. We're talking about sujood sahu. We're talking about all the different kinds of prayers, whether tarawih, witr, duha, just a general sujood shukr, I guess, jama'ah, women's attendance in mosques and or masajid, and certainly legal excuses for leaving prayer, Jum'ah prayer to the Salat al-Eid, Salat al-Kusuf, Salat al-Istisqa, the death and Salat al-Janaza and so forth. So we've got a lot to cover, and hopefully we could do, inshallah, the detailed and rather summarized, hopefully, inshallah, but and also covering the issues that matter to you. So give me a second, please. I'll let you take a breath. Okay, any questions before we move on? You can unmute yourselves, so that's another thing that's pretty good, that you can mute yourself and not necessarily feel that that you have to wait up on me.
Oh, so it's more interactive, you're saying?
So it's not interactive per se. I mean, yes, I will
I
give
mean, like when you have a question, Yani.
right. So when you have a question, yes, you can ask the question. I do prefer waiting because, you know, with my experience, I can anticipate what questions you have. So I will usually lay out, let's call it the foundational part, and then the modern issues or the questions that people usually ask, I usually ask it later. So I've been teaching this class for about right now almost 18 years. So I'm very familiar with what questions people usually ask, and what details that usually confuses them, and what details they're usually I guess not feeling comfortable with. So I'm familiar with that. So if you could just give me some time, because I can anticipate what questions you're going to ask, and then just give me some time. And if you feel that I'm going to a different topic and still the question was not asked, go ahead and raise the topic, raise the question. Okay? Did I answer that, Noura? Okay, so let me just give a couple things, just an overview, quick overview, not too detailed, in regards to fiqh. What is fiqh? And in general, the word fiqh actually comes from the root faqha. Let me write that down, and this is just a really quick thing. So when we say fiqh al-ibadat, or the fiqh of worship, what does that actually mean? So the word fiqh actually means Islam, to understand. So this is just in general. It just means to understand something, comprehend something. And when we speak about fiqh, it became later on a specific terminology, and it became a technical term which relates to basically deriving the rulings deriving the rulings that basically relate to human action. Okay, so we're not talking about aqidah here. It's just going to be all about human action, and certainly in relationship to the human action, we're going to be talking about what is permissible, what is not permissible, and certainly we're speaking about using the detailed evidences. So using detailed evidences. So just keep that in mind when we're speaking about evidences. We're making sure that when we speak of Islam, when we speak of fiqh, it cannot whatsoever be based on our own opinion. It's not how I or you feel about something. It's about what evidences do we have to prove a different matter. And especially when it comes to ritual, you want to keep in mind that there is no point of logic that we could turn to, because ibadat in general are basically called within the area of tawqifi. Let me use that word again. So what does tawqifi mean? Tawqifi comes from the root وقف, which actually means to stand, which actually means to stay idle, okay? So when we're speaking about fiqh of worship, all the different matters, they don't relate to a specific logic, to a specific, I would say, reasoning. We don't really have a certain reasoning. It's all textual based, and that's what that tawqifi means. It's textual based and not necessarily logic based or talking about some kind of an analogy. We don't necessarily have a clear analogy to why we would do certain worship in that way, because it all goes back to the way how the Prophet ﷺ had taught us, and how Jibreel alayhi salam had revealed it to the Prophet ﷺ. So that would be our place of, let's call it our area of understanding, in our area of referencing, and our area of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So again, it's our area of referencing, our area of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and our area of understanding, submission, and referencing. All of those are basically within the word tawqifi. Okay, so tawqifi would mean that we would consider the text itself / al-wahi to be our resource. 2, that we would basically submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala using what we would know in regards to worship, and we would stick to what was revealed. And 3, that would be our understanding, our perimeter of what would make something permissible or not permissible. And therefore, we wouldn't necessarily say, well, this is how I would analyze this, and get into some kind of an analogy in regards to, a couple days ago, someone sent me some video about some guy who was in Mecca analyzing why we would go around the Kaaba 7 times, and why the Kaaba would be to our left and not to our right, and why we would basically rotate in the way we're rotating, and what happens when we do sujood, and talking about negative energy and positive energy and all of that. In ibadat, all of that is tawqifi. To talk about negative energy and what happens when this is on your left side, and what happens when we start bowing down and talking about negative energy or positive karma and all of that, there's no evidence whatsoever. So we would have to stick with ibadat to what was revealed, period. Any type of analogy that we are creating as a narrative and trying to explain that why we would perform a certain ibadah in a certain way, or what really happens, and all these kinds of details would actually stand in an area of question. And definitely we would see that the scholars of fiqh, especially when it comes to ibadat, we would definitely start getting into the mode of, sorry, but I cannot whatsoever import your interpretation, because it's not necessarily standing on any basis within my text. So what does that mean? We don't know the details of ibadat and the details of ibadat in terms of the inspiration in how the makeover of it is done, and what really happens when I make sujood. Why do I do it in this way? We just, at the end, sami'na wa ata'na. We don't really have these evidences, these interpretations to make it in any way inspirational, because the second we would do that, we're going to find ourselves creating our own fantasy about something, which definitely, like from the name definition of fantasy, it would more be our own imagination. So we don't get into imagination. We stick to number 2, which what we had said, we basically get into the submission without going into that analogy. So just think of it and relate it in those ways. So when we do the detailed evidences, what does it mean? I know there's a typo. What do we mean by detailed evidences? So the detailed evidences is not how I feel about something whatsoever. The detailed evidences is that I would go back first to the Quran as an evidence, but certainly, well, if we're going to go back to the Quran, it's not enough to say, well, I had read the translation, because we got to make sure that we go back to the Quran, we go back to to the Quran resources, and certainly sometimes the different qira'at, sometimes the different reasons for revelation, which actually takes me to the second resource, which is hadith. So hadith would be a second resource, and certainly sometimes we need the scholars of hadith to basically tell me and verify the authenticity of a certain hadith, for example, which I probably am not necessarily the expert to necessarily discover and know and judge whether this hadith is authentic or not. Not to mention that some hadith do actually have differences of opinions on their level of authenticity. So just keep that one in mind. Okay, so that's the second referencing that we'll be going back to, which is hadith, and we'll sometimes talk about certain hadith in certain details. Okay, number 3 reference, that's going to basically be qiyas, but we're not going to be using qiyas often, which is using analogy, because this one, there is no qiyas in ibadat. So there's no qiyas in fiqh of worship. There's no qiyas in fiqh of worship, so that stands out as really not something that we'll be often using, but there's also the consensus. And of course, when we're speaking about the consensus, when we're consensus, okay, here we go. When we're speaking about consensus, we're actually talking about, well, do we really have an evidence for that? So that's why we'll often be using different resources to help us know what were the Sahaba saying. So we'll talk about companions and what they had said, or even the different scholars and what their state on that was based on, of course, what they had learned from the different tabi'in and so forth. So those are some of those areas that we'll be discussing, inshallah, in terms of how the word fiqh goes. So ibadat, what are ibadat? When we say ibadat, fiqh of worship, what does that involve? Well, that involves prayer, that involves tahara as well, or purification, that involves fasting, that involves zakah, that involves hajj. Now, some scholars add it as part of the fiqh of worship, which is the chapter on udhiyah, slaughtering, and certainly because it's involved to hajj, so they'll add that as part of what would be considered as part of worship. Okay, just a note. Now, any questions before we start the official start for fiqh al-ibadat? So if you have any questions, go ahead. You could just unmute yourself.
So what does qiyas mean? Just so I know what the definition
Qiyas?
is.
Okay, fair enough. So qiyas actually means to measure something, okay? But this is not necessarily to measure per se. This is a technical term where the word qiyas basically means that I'm using, let's say, a known matter, okay? So let's give an example here. I would use alcohol. I know that alcohol has a certain ruling that which we would know in Quran and Sunnah that it is haram. Now, the reasoning for why it is prohibited is because it leads to intoxication. Now, is this related to ibadat in worship? The answer is no. It's not related to that. I've got a clear analogy and a clear reasoning to why alcohol is haram, making the reasoning based on the hadith is because it leads to intoxication. Okay, Now we have modern substances that don't necessarily have any evidences in the Quran or Sunnah to tell me whether this is halal, haram to use, etc. So we're talking about different drugs, different substances, illegal drugs, or different cocaine, CBD, all these different items out there. Are they haram or halal? What does the Quran say about it? Someone can say, well, there's no evidence in the Quran because cocaine was not at the time prepared in the way that people prepare it today. Okay, maybe the plant was there, marijuana, maybe the plant was there, but certainly people didn't use it the same way that people use it today. Okay, so we would say, okay, well, what does it lead to? They say, well, it leads to intoxication. Does it make the person not aware? Does it harm the body? Yes, it does. Okay, then we're going to say we're going to do that qiyas based on subject A. We're going to rule on subject B, which are those drugs, and we're going to say, well, since they both have a common result, a common effect on human body, then in that situation, they should have the consequence of the same ruling. That's what qiyas is. So we would rule on drugs based on the ruling of subject A, which is alcohol, which leads to matter of what they would both have in common, which is intoxication. So they would take the same ruling. Is that clear, Asia?
Yes, thank you.
So
Jazakallah
this
khair.
is what qiyas is. Now, qiyas, it can be done on so many different substances. In pretty much all fiqh is we do consider taking qiyas. So if we were studying probably transactions, we could do qiyas. If we're studying probably food, maybe perhaps different items, clothes, all the other chapters, we will use qiyas, but in terms of fiqh of worship, we don't use this kind of analogy because we don't necessarily have, let's call it a certain logic. Okay, we don't have a logic that we could turn to when it comes to worship. So we can't necessarily use logic as a reference to understanding some kind of an element in how we would, well, just like you would do this here, you could do this here. Let's give an example. Should we pray Salat al-Duhur 4 rak'ahs, or should we pray at 5? Well, why not make it 5? I mean, hey, I've got my energy. It's duhur time. I feel pretty strong. Let me do duhur into 5 rak'ahs instead of 4. Do we really have an analogy? Do I have some kind of a logic to why duhur is 4? How about wiping on, let's say, the socks or the khuf? Why wipe on the top and not at the bottom? But I'm stepping at the bottom and certainly not the top. Why am I making wudu on the different areas that we do wudu on? And why not perhaps jump into the pool? How do we understand all of this? So we don't necessarily have a specific logic behind it, and that's why we don't use qiyas in fiqh of worship, but we would use it in other chapters, pretty much all chapters, but not fiqh of worship, because it is tawqifi. That's the word. Tawqifi is textual based and therefore not logic based. So not logic based. It's not logic based, and therefore we would basically make sure that we are returning and turning to the text and not to our logic, because all the different acts in worship are not necessarily relating to any kind of an analogy that we can somehow understand why we do tawaf. Why are we going around the Kaaba? What's the logic behind it? Why are we making soup? Why can't we just sit on a chair and make a better focus and probably close our eyes and perhaps read a book, or maybe look out the window, look at the sun as it's rising or setting, and make some kind of a humming sound? Why can't we just do that? It'll help me focus. Why can't I just do breathing sounds just like yoga? Hey, it'll probably give me a better reflection on my inner self rather than my outer self. How about that? So because we don't have a specific logic to it, we would just basically وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا أَن يَكُونَ لَهُمُ الْخِيَرَةُ مِنْ أَمْرِهِمْ. It is not befit for a believing man or woman when the decree of the Lord Almighty is said that they would put their own statement before the Lord Almighty. So we are Muslim, therefore we would submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore, for us to submit to Allah, we would go back to the textual evidences to prove whether something is acceptable, whether something is considered the ritual, the practice, the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted me to practice this ritual. Okay, so I hope I answered that one. Any other question before we move on, dear? One thing I would like to say, fiqh can seem, pause for a second. Fiqh can seem, and I was in your shoes when I was an undergrad and I entered Sharia school, and I thought in I guess, my hopes when I first entered Sharia school is that I was going to get into an inspiration, it was going to grow into my iman, etc. But think of it this way. You know, just like when you would see somebody skating, somebody swimming, it just feels like they're gliding. But when you come in and this is your first time, all you're going to be facing is probably falling, lots of bruises. You're just going to be thinking to yourself, well, how do I see them gliding? This is harder than I expected. So in the beginning, you're really not going to get the taste of how this is inspirational. You're just going to feel like this is really like climbing up a mountain where all I'm feeling is just sores around my body. I'm not feeling that there is anything fun in this. And it's just going to feel like you're giving me a bunch of rituals, you're giving me a bunch of borders, but you're not teaching me how to get into the inspiration, how I can relate to my prayer, and how I can make my prayer a place of khushu' for me. Okay. In the beginning, it's going to feel like this is extremely boring. Where's the inspiration in this? And I will tell you, I had even met some people that probably stopped praying or probably left Islam because they thought that there were too many rituals, too many different restrictions, too many different details, etc. But of course, you can't expect to say, well, how does that person glide unless you become, let's say, a person that is well versed in it. So these details are not to make things harder on you, but they're to eliminate all the different distractions, whether we're speaking about the distractions that are touching your body, which is relating to purification, or we're talking about the different distractions that you might and might not know. Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ask us to make sujood this way? What does it do? Why is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asking us to do ruku' this way? Why are we facing the qibla? What is the inspiration behind that? So that's exactly what you'll find in the ahadith. You might not get a sense of it in the beginning, but it isn't until you put in a better practice. It isn't until you really embrace the ritual, embrace Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, embrace the intention, will you really feel that khushu', will you really feel what it means to be in this state. So this is to help you grow in your deen and not otherwise. But in the beginning, like I said, it's going to feel like you're falling. What's the fun thing about this? I'm just trying to skate, and here I am. I'm just falling. And I wanted to swim. It seems fun, but all that's happening to me is that I'm drowning. How fun can that be? Well, it's not fun at all to think about the falls. But definitely the person that had become a professional in skating, a professional in swimming, a professional in doing the art of whatever they're doing, this becomes similar to the art where the person will become a person that embraces the beauty of that ibadah, embraces the khushu', and embraces and helps them grow in their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But how do we actually get that far? Well, we have to recognize that there are different contaminants, which is why we study this chapter of purification. There are different contaminants that we have to learn how to remove first, because these contaminants, they cannot slow down your ability to process a number of different things. Think of it as light, think of it as different inspirations that you would be getting, all those different areas. So why purification? What affects our body? What affects our mind? What affects our heart is basically all the different things that surround us, including the things that could be touching our body, or probably our body touching, or body probably producing. So that's why we get into this, okay? And I always like to get the inspiration about this one in Surah, which surah is it? Who could remember the surah that we would always open up when we're speaking about tahara? And who could remember that?
Is it Surah Ma'idah?
Surah Al-Ma'idah. So I've got the surah that I always open up when I'm talking about tahara, and it's going to be in the Juz' Tabarak. Now, could you remember? We talked about it before many times, and we said it's a very important surah, and that's basically Ya ayyuhal muddathir. Here we go. So when you look at Ya ayyuhal muddathir, it's basically taking us into recognizing the Prophet ﷺ was early, in other words, early in his Islam, but he was already doing his meditation in Ghar Hira. He was already doing one form of ibadah, that meditation. How was he doing it? What was he really doing? He was just being in a moment of silence, in a moment of tafakkur, in a moment of deep ponderance, not any specific ibadah yet. It wasn't any specific worship that he was doing. All right. Then he gets Jibreel alayhi salam. We know the story. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is trembling of fear, runs down to Khadija's home, and that's when the ayah comes to him with Jibreel alayhi salam telling him, Ya ayyuhal muddathir, oh, the one that is all bundled up in his own blanket. Well, there's no bundling anymore. Qum fa'andir. I want you to get up, and I want you to get up with a mission, which is to warn. A person on a mission can definitely not live as a person in deep comfort all the time. Because when we're speaking about comfort, then that's going to make you all cozy, and then you're not going to be capable of going beyond and being a person on a mission. That's why they would basically let the soldiers get into a lot of pains, probably jumping, hurdling, and probably climbing things, going underneath things, probably hitting things, etc. All these different things in order to let the body learn how to get the training to overcome the different pains and not necessarily fall from the first pain. So qum fa'andir, that's that area that we get the inspiration in that you've got a mission, whether your mission is to continue the Prophet's legacy or whether your mission as a Muslim is to basically get to Jannah. So قُمْ فَأَنذِرْ is telling us, well, you've got a mission to basically warn the others, O Prophet of Allah, to warn the others of the purpose that preceded their existence, which is Judgment Day, that they'll be held accountable for, and the timing that they are given in this dunya is basically the privilege for them to perhaps use in order to pass and certainly succeed on Judgment Day. وَرَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ. But there's no way that a person can be a person of, let's say, a mission or a person passing on and moving on with a legacy unless وَرَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ, unless they take the time to glorify the Lord Almighty, unless they take the time to recognize that the Lord Almighty is their center of glory, is their center which they would consider as the highest place of magnificence. Basically, you would consider that. And once that is considered, then you're going to take in stage 2. So let's look at this. We've got number 1, stage 1, after the order in speaking to you or speaking, well, to the Prophet ﷺ, the first order was qum, get up. فَأَنذِرْ, order 2. Qum, you gotta get up. فَأَنذِرْ, 2. Then you have to warn. وَرَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ, here's order 3, and glorify your Lord Almighty. Here's order number 3. Order number 4, وَثِيَابَكَ فَطَهِّرْ, and for your garments, you need to maintain them in a state of purity. And that was order 4. Number 5, وَالرُّجْزَ فَهْجُرْ. وَالرُّجْزَ فَهْجُرْ, الرُّجْز is a general statement, to basically include all the different types of contaminants, whether we're speaking about physical contaminations, such as maybe physical contaminations, impurities, urine, feces, etc., or whether we're speaking about behavioral contaminations, lying, cheating, betraying. Those would be just different actions, moral contaminations that different people might engage in, and that would be aruj. Fahjur, you're basically abstaining. You're making this complete separation between you and the different contaminations, be it physical or be it moral contamination. وَلَا تَمْنُنْ تَسْتَكْثِرْ. In part of the moral contamination, in case one didn't think that moral contamination was included, so the ayah is emphasizing and saying, well, وَلَا تَمْنُنْ تَسْتَكْثِرْ, and don't brag about something in ways to get more of your interest in fulfilling your interest. وَلِرَبِّكَ فَاصْبِرْ. But there's no way. Here's number 5. This is number 6, I guess. وَلِرَبِّكَ فَاصْبِرْ. There's no way that you can go up the ladder in your inspiration or in your connection with the Lord Almighty and spirituality unless you invested وَلِرَبِّكَ فَاصْبِرْ. But that you would basically have to recognize that to your Lord, be patient. What does it mean to be patient? It means to be patient in 1, acquiring ilm, patient in following the orders of the Lord Almighty, whether that was the obligations or whether that is abstaining from the different prohibitions, or whether that was living the principles of the Lord Almighty. Is there going to be pain? Certainly there's going to be some pain. Certainly there's going to be a lot of compromise. Certainly with that compromise, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will basically reward you for whatever you had compromised. You're going to compromise your dunya. You're going to compromise a lot of different comforts. You're going to need to compromise on a lot of perhaps different things that you would love, and simply because Jannah is definitely something worth to go for. وَلِرَبِّكَ فَاصْبِرْ, and that's why it takes you فَإِذَا نُقِرَ فِي النَّاقُورِ. فَإِذَا نُقِرَ فِي النَّاقُورِ, meaning, and if the horn, on when the horn will be blown, that's to tell us that the reason why we're going through all of this is basically to completely purify us for the day when the horn is blown on Judgment Day, and then you are to face exactly the purpose that preceded your existence, and that basically was to mark the fate of what every single person was basically going to be driven to, either Jannah or hellfire. نسأل الله العفو والعافية. So when we speak of purification, we're definitely speaking of something that involves religion, something that involves spirituality, something that involves the legacy, something that involves our connection with our spirituality, is basically going one in relationship with our mind, because there's no way that you can get to رَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ. There's no way that you can get to that, your mind basically understanding what comes first, and basically understanding that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is your soul center, unless your mind itself recognized that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the greatest one. Number two, ثِيَابَكَ فَطَهِّرْ. This actually involves all those different areas of spirituality. Why would there be that spirituality? Because as a prophet, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells him that he has a legacy to carry, and therefore there's a certain spirituality that cannot be attained unless the person practices a lot of sabr, a lot of endurance, a lot of patience, and certainly there will be a number of different trips and a number of different falls. Okay, how about we give you like 3 minutes of a break or 5 minutes of a break, and we'll come back, inshallah. We'll do that like at the the top of the hour, and give you like a 5-minute break, kind of get your coffee or drink something, and we'll inshallah resume.